8. Countdown. Once we brought any troops in, that was the nose of the camel. It would be difficult to know how much was enough. General Maxwell D. Taylor, Ambassador to Saigon, 1964 to 65. Around midnight on the 31st of July, 1964, a cluster of South Vietnamese assault boats sped out of Da Nang at the southern lip of the C-shaped Gulf of Tonkin. Their target was two North Vietnamese offshore islands 60 miles from the coast at the 19th parallel. 100 miles southeast, the destroyer USS Maddox was bearing toward the Gulf, with orders to stay at least 8 miles from shore. With its sophisticated radar and monitoring equipment, the Maddox was the eyes of the Honolulu Pacific Naval Command. It was described as being on a routine mission and several hours distant when the South Vietnamese gunboats struck at the two tiny islands named Hon Mi and Hon Niu. For a few minutes, an intense firefight seared the 3 a.m. darkness as the swift PT boats raked the island garrisons, then raced for home. This covert attack on North Vietnamese coastal facilities was also considered routine by now. Operation 34A had lasted 6 months, but this time the harassment snapped a nerve somewhere ashore. As the USS Maddox neared the coast 36 hours later, 2nd of August, she urgently signaled Honolulu. From there, a priority alert was flashed to Washington. The Maddox was exchanging fire with 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. She gave her position at 30 miles offshore in international waters. Though the time was nearing midnight in Washington, the Joint Chiefs aroused President Johnson. At the Pentagon and at the State Department, those involved in the contingency planning began a fateful though brief vigil. William Bundy, who would draft Johnson's version and verdict, had no doubt at least about this first U.S. North Vietnamese engagement in the Gulf. There was a clear-cut attack on one American destroyer on the August 2nd, says Bundy. There has never been any doubt of the attack. Bullet holes, all the rest. The Maddox now reported that she had repulsed and damaged all 3 raiders. Johnson ordered another destroyer, the USS C. Turner Joy, to join the Maddox, and by the early hours of the 4th of August, the 2 American warships resumed the intelligence mission, code-named DeSoto. Bundy says there were 50 to 75 miles off the coast when they linked up. At the same time as the destroyers turned back into the Gulf, more South Vietnamese 34A ships were striking coastal installations. It was again midnight Pacific time, 12 hours earlier in Washington, when Naval Command sent its next DeSoto red alert. The North Vietnamese were attacking. Bundy says a destroyer reported, and it was during the night, that it had been attacked again, and it had seen torpedo wakes, and so on and so on. Within minutes, the security chiefs had convened. With President Johnson's approval, it was decided to start immediately Phase 1 of the bombing scenario. A single retaliatory strike. Fighter bombers of the 7th Fleet would take out the first of the pre-selected targets. Washington cabled Honolulu, a prearranged code. Prepare to launch Pierce Arrow. It was 3 a.m. in the Northwest Pacific. The carrier planes began to load up for launch at 10:30 hours, 5th of August. At 4 a.m. Pacific time, Honolulu set another urgent flash. It advised the Joint Chiefs weather stormy, heavy seas, DeSoto uncertain of actual attack or any damage. In the Pentagon War Room, Defense Secretary McNamara picked up the hotline to the President. They decided there had to be firm confirmation that the destroyers had not been attacked. The bombing countdown continued. At dawn Pacific time, Honolulu again cabled that rough seas still prevented verification of any damage. It was unclear in all the cables whether the destroyers had actually sighted North Vietnamese ships, but Washington was told to stand by for earlier radio intercepts picked up by the Maddox. As these were decoded, Johnson summoned congressional leaders to the Oval Office and informed them of the attack. 4 hours remained in the countdown. The White House now alerted the national television networks to stand by for a possible presidential address to the nation. At the Pentagon, McNamara mildly named study group, among them Daniel Ellsberg, were relaying the coordinates from their target list. Liaising at state. William Bundy evaluated the radio intercepts as the minutes ticked by without further advice from the storm-beset destroyers. With 30 minutes left in the countdown, Johnson was called for makeup for the television cameras. As the red lights went on, a message went across the Pacific: launch Pierce Arrow. The bombers were in the air as Johnson told the nation. Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply. In the first bombing of North Vietnam, 64 naval aircraft struck the oil storage and port facilities at Vinh, just north of the partition line. The Pentagon estimated that 10% of the North's oil supply had been destroyed. It had taken 10 minutes. The United States had directly entered the Vietnam War without declaration at 11 a.m., 5th of August, 1964. It would be many years later before debate began on what really happened in the remote Pacific and on whether Congress had been deceived into supporting the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, approving Johnson's action and further actions. William Bundy, who drafted the resolution, cites the evidence on which Johnson acted. We had intercepted North Vietnamese messages that followed in sequence on the date of August 4th. Get ready to attack, advance readiness, and go ahead. Well, this intelligence evidence, which in the case of the intercepts could not be disclosed at the time, seemed to all of us in the government to make it conclusive that North Vietnam had made a second attack. And it was on the basis of that, and the feeling that this had now turned into a challenge to the United States, that President Johnson, immediately after talking to the congressional leaders, took the action of a small but important bombing attack. We thought it was a clear-cut case of an unprovoked attack on our destroyers in international waters, and that we had to respond. Says Daniel Ellsberg, it was not unprovoked, and the mission of the Maddox was not a routine patrol. In his ultra-confidential Pentagon post, Ellsberg felt that the intelligence-gathering destroyers were effectively backing up the covert 34A raids. As to the crucial 4th of August incident, Ellsberg says that among the Pentagon planners at the time, there was a great uncertainty as to whether there was such an attack. Tremendous uncertainty. So much so that the Commodore on the spot had recommended delaying any retaliation at all until there could be a daytime reconnaissance to see if there had been any attack. In retrospect, it is unequivocally clear that there was no second attack. Very few Americans would ever come to realize that, but the evidence has been pinned down by now. But even at the time, the statement that it was a clear attack to which we were justified in responding to so fast was a lie. Ellsberg says the alleged second attack was used to get the functional equivalent of a declaration of war from Congress, and that Johnson did not ask for an actual declaration, lest he raise the debate again. In this way, Congress gave what amounted to a blank check. Johnson wanted, says Ellsberg, to underline by bombs, by a little killing, the threats that he was already making in Hanoi. At the same time, he didn't want to reveal the threats which did indeed foreshadow an endless war of enormous proportions. So, Tonkin Gulf seemed to give him the perfect opportunity to carry out a little bombing while not suggesting that it was part of a larger program of bombing, which it was. The man who had the responsibility of putting many of Johnson's key policies into words, Assistant Secretary of State William Bundy, discloses that the need for a congressional resolution had been considered 3 months earlier. The president felt that if we wanted to stabilize the situation, establish a clear-cut American policy for the future, that we should get a congressional resolution. We had in the government discussions of such a resolution back in May. It was in May that Johnson received the completed bombing scenario. But, says Bundy, these earlier discussions had been completely put to one side and shelved. As Bundy puts it, the expectation within the government was that we would at least go through the period of the American election without any further change in policy. But we felt that these two attacks forced the issue, and we had better get the congressional resolution at that stage. And we presented what I still believe was a completely honest picture. The key figure in getting congressional backing was William Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Fulbright recalls that on the 5th of August, some 4 hours before the bombing began, he and other Senate and House leaders were briefed by the President, Secretary of State, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the Secretary of Defense, Mr. McNamara, who played a very important part in this, about these attacks and that these should be repulsed. It was outrageous. The attack upon us, upon our ships. Fulbright then heard of the proposed resolution, a resolution by the administration, drawn up, he says, by William Bundy. Bundy claims that Fulbright and the others were told of the covert 34A raids, and that one of these had come only a short time before the first attack. But, says Bundy, there was no operational connection between the South Vietnamese assault boats and the U.S. destroyers, and we said so to the senators. Fulbright recalls being told that the destroyers were attacked while they were on the high seas, and without provocation. Fulbright, a lawyer and close friend of Johnson during 18 years shared in the Senate, had been a principal election speaker for the president in the previous months. I made speeches that he was a man who would keep peace around the world, and Senator Barry Goldwater was considered the warmonger. He was going to threaten them or use nuclear weapons and so on. And I made speeches on the floor criticizing Goldwater and supporting Johnson. I made speeches that there was no intention to send troops, ground troops to Vietnam. The General and General MacArthur, I think, had made speeches before that it would be insanity to mount a land war in Asia, and so on. I said that in the course of the debate, when the Gulf of Tonkin resolution came to the Senate, Fulbright, who told friends he could never believe LBJ would lay the wool on him, quotes Johnson as saying that if Congress would pass the resolution quickly, and he was most urgent about this, it would create a mood on the part of the Vietnamese to settle the war. He sold it as a means to prevent any widening of the war. That we were going to face this little country of, he said, 17 million people, with the great might of the United States. They would clearly be inclined to settle and to compromise, and there wouldn't be any war. In other words, if we acted together and showed our united strength, this was the way to prevent a major war. Bundy counters this by stating that he and Fulbright, both one-time lawyers, worked over Bundy's department draft so that there would be a complete understanding that this was intended to authorize responses in the future, if there should be any further repetition of this kind of attack on our destroyers. Bundy wrote David Halberstam in the best and the brightest, knew something about Vietnam, and had more sophistication about the war and the enemy than most of the players. Brains were not his problem. It was a question of assumptions. Bundy assumed the Congress would comfortably identify sections of the resolution, word for word the same, he says, with the one it had itself initiated 2 years earlier during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he concedes that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was a much broader mandate. It authorized the President to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against U.S. forces in Southeast Asia, and it approved in advance all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, in meeting any request by the SEATO nations for assistance. Spelled S-E-A-T-O. Bundy states, I would make 2 points: that the Congress understood what was being asked of them and participated fully in the framing of the resolution. Secondly, although there were a few marginal facts that were not known to the executive at the time, none of them affected the belief that there had been 2 clear-cut North Vietnamese attacks. I don't think anyone considered it a declaration of war, says Fulbright. I don't think anyone thought of it as an authorization to wage the kind of war that Johnson waged. Despite the doubts about Saigon's capability, Fulbright says he and Congress believed that with a show of strength, the South Vietnamese would win the war. And that was the way it was sold to us. It was never sold as a declaration of war, says Fulbright. On the 7th of August, the resolution was passed first by the House, 416 to 0, then introduced by Fulbright, by the Senate, 88 to 2. Senators Wayne Morse and Ernest Gruening were the dissenting votes. In the space of 3 days, the Johnson administration had implemented the 2 key elements of the May scenario: the initial first strike at North Vietnam and congressional endorsement of it. The resolution, to quote the Pentagon Papers, set U.S. public support for virtually any action. Fulbright made a profuse public apology a few months later for his congressional role, charging that Johnson had misled him. But he also depicts Johnson as a product of his background and of the system. He was an extremely able man, big physically, and a powerful intellect, but with no training and no experience for the presidency. He had hardly been out of the country before he became president. I think he had been to Mexico. In any event, he had no background in foreign relations, and I think that the Texans, and he especially, had a way of feeling that they could do anything. He believed that with the primitive society the Vietnamese had, they couldn't possibly prevail against the United States with its unlimited power. The president says, Fulbright, could not understand the restraints that went with such power. This was much too subtle for Johnson. Johnson's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, disputes this, saying that Johnson, as soon as he took office, urged restraints. He said, if we stay there, Vietnam, very long, or if we have to increase our effort, we must go to the Congress. That was the basic origin of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Rusk, like the deputy William Bundy, insists there was no deception. Years later, when Rusk was called to give Senate testimony, or in his words, when some dispute broke out over the facts, he was questioned as to whether the administration had done all it might during the countdown. Why did the military, or Johnson's senior people, not call the captains of the two destroyers? They were available. Why didn't they call them to see what they thought was happening? Rusk remembers the question as if he, subsequently, had wondered about this himself. But in any event, says Rusk, in my testimony, I told them exactly what I thought was the truth. Asked if Senator Fulbright was wrong to feel betrayed, Rusk replied, that's correct. Fulbright feels that after the Gulf of Tonkin, Firebreak Johnson, like Kennedy before him, was tormented by the division among the closest advisers as to who was right or wrong on Vietnam, and he had no basis to judge it. He was being torn by two kinds of thought. On the one hand, mine and Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. On the other hand, Rusk, Bundy, and McNamara, and above all, General Taylor. Taylor had replaced Henry Cabot Lodge as ambassador to Saigon 3 weeks earlier. He had fully concurred with the bombing strategy. I was convinced, says Taylor, that we could get at least 3 advantages in the use of our air power. First, morale in South Vietnam. To give them the feeling of striking back would certainly mean a great deal to them. Secondly, of course, a great deal of war equipment and manpower was being sent in by the North. I had no impression that we could stop that, but at least we could inflict losses. We could slow it down. Finally, I felt the air arm gave us a device by which, if used gradually and decisively, we could convince Hanoi that the price was too great to pay. We visualized a progressive movement of airstrikes of increasing intensity towards Hanoi until they were faced with the obliteration of the capital if they didn't come to the negotiating table and seek a solution. General Maxwell Davenport Taylor, 4th in his West Point class of 1922, was regarded as America's 4-star intellectual. He had the reputation of a military thinker in 2 previous administrations. Under Eisenhower, while Army Chief of Staff in 1955, he had argued against a policy of nuclear retaliation, instead favoring stronger conventional capability. Under Kennedy, he investigated and condemned the Cuban Bay of Pigs invasion. Taylor became Kennedy's personal military advisor and was among the few who counseled against the overthrow of President Ngo Dinh. In July 1962, Taylor was appointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a position he retained under Johnson while arguing for a combination of civilian reforms in the South and military pressure on the North. The general was viewed as the perfect ambassador. With Taylor's arrival, and that of the new field commander, General William Westmoreland, the problems in the U.S. command structure were presumed resolved. The previous commander and ambassador had become increasingly divided over policy and lines of authority. This had caused tension both in Saigon and Washington. But Taylor had made numerous missions to Vietnam. He had first-hand knowledge of the country, and it was expected that Westmoreland, with his World War II expertise in rapid infantry deployment, would quickly shake up the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and its guerrillas, while deferring politically to his former chief of staff at the embassy. Hanoi would feel the stick in both North and South. But Johnson found the reports and recommendations from his new field men ever more foreboding. Taylor cabled that communist infiltration had recently increased by an estimated 34,000 men, or 30%. Westmoreland cabled that his MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, advisory force must have 4,000 additional troops immediately. Westmoreland already felt that things were being politically mishandled. There was a tendency by Mr. Johnson's administration to low-key the war. They wanted to avoid getting the American public aroused. Westmoreland recalls that he then informed Defense Secretary McNamara that it was going to be a long, drawn-out affair. It was going to test the patience of the American people. Ambassador Taylor was advising that the war might prove all too short. He directly cabled the president stating that the Khan government had only a 50-50 chance of lasting out the year. The military outcome was still jeopardized by social and political decay, says Taylor. I was not a newcomer. I knew the ambience and general problems. Ever since the overthrow of Diem, we had nothing but disorder. It was perfectly apparent that we were going downhill and losing course. And if we didn't change that course, we had better change our objectives. Taylor's cable to Johnson, dated the 10th of August, only 5 days after the first bombing of the North, was a recommendation to proceed to Phase 2 sustained bombing. The ambassador proposed to the president that he implement contingency plans against North Vietnam with optimum readiness by January 1st, 1965. Johnson had now to decide for himself on further escalation. Among his senior advisors, there was none left who counseled against it. On his Oval Office desk, alongside Taylor's cable, Johnson read and reread another dramatic opinion, that of the American public. The verdict of a Harris poll was that the nation admired his firm handling of the Gulf of Tonkin crisis. His personal popularity had soared from 42 to 72% overnight. The election was only 3 months away, but after Tonkin, Johnson had pledged to limit American involvement if possible. Taylor was telling him it was impossible. Taylor had called it right on Diem. Was he right about Khan? Could Vietnam, and perhaps public support, be lost at any time? Westmoreland wanted to rally the public behind the war, and the president certainly had the public with him. But the promised mandate, Johnson knew, would also be a vote for moderation, or fear of hawk Republican opponent Senator Goldwater. Yet now Johnson's own administration had hardened in favor of Goldwater's position and secretly planned escalation, and now sought to expedite it. His inherited circle of advisers no longer shielded, it shackled. The military chiefs, McNamara, Taylor, Westmoreland, were telling him that action escalation was imperative. Taylor's cable of the 10th of August, urging a deadline for optimum action against the North, perhaps had additional significance in its timing. The ambassador knew that Canadian intermediary Blair Seaborn had left Saigon that very day on a second secret mission to Hanoi. Johnson now found no enthusiasm for bargaining with Hanoi, nor was he doing so. There was to be no hint of a carrot this time, just a heavier emphasis on the stick. The timing of the 5th of August bombing and Johnson's second use of the Canadian Channel was also significantly close. Within hours of the airstrike, Washington had arranged with Ottawa to test Hanoi with a tougher message. It would state flatly that both U.S. destroyers had been attacked. Seaborn was to say that while the confrontation in the Gulf was unsought, the U.S. was now obliged to increase its forces in South Vietnam. Hanoi was thus informed of these military moves before the American public. The June peace package, drafted as a potential follow-up to Seaborn's first visit to Hanoi, had been totally discarded. There was not now to be any ultimatum or even a specific warning. Seaborn was not to state if or when the bombing would resume, and Ambassador Taylor's 10th of August cable proposing a bombing deadline was sent after he had seen a copy of the non-specific message to be carried by Seaborn. This went to Saigon on the 8th of August. Top Secret State 383 to Embassy, Saigon. Canadians are urgently asked to have Seaborn make following points as conveyed to him by U.S. government, August 6. Number 1. Neither the Maddox or any other destroyer was in any way associated with any attack on the DRV Islands. Number 2. Regarding the August 4th attack by the DRV on the two U.S. destroyers, the Americans were and are at a complete loss to understand the DRV motive. About the only reasonable hypothesis was that North Vietnam was intent either upon making it appear that the United States was a paper tiger or upon provoking the United States. Number 3. Our response, for the moment, will be limited and fitting. Number 4. In view of the uncertainty aroused by the deliberate and unprovoked DRV attacks of this character, the U.S. has necessarily carried out precautionary deployments of additional air power to South Vietnam and Thailand. In Hanoi, Seaborn found noticeable change. People were conducting air raid drills and digging street trenches and brick bunkers. Evacuation of women and children was being prepared, he reported. Politically, Hanoi was also digging in. This time, Seaborn waited 3 days before Premier Pham Van Dong would see him, and after delivering the message, Pham's reaction was extremely angry. There had been no DRV provocation. Rather, the U.S. had found it is necessary to carry the war to the north in order to find out a way out of the impasse in the south. And Johnson worries also, of course, about the coming electoral battle in which it is necessary to outbid the Republican candidate. In a furious tone, Pham told Seaborn that if the war came to the North, the U.S. would be creating a very dangerous situation. I repeat, very dangerous, and it would be a real miscalculation. Up to now, we have tried to avoid serious trouble, the Prime Minister said, but it becomes more difficult now because the war has been carried to our territory. Pham delivered his own warning. If the war comes to North Vietnam, it will come to the whole of Southeast Asia, and unforeseeable consequences. As Seaborn noted in his secret report, Pham's reaction was anything but retreat. We don't hide the fact that the people will have to make many sacrifices, the Prime Minister said, but we are in a state of legitimate defense because the war is imposed on us. He was visibly angry, shaking his fist as he emphasized points, and Seaborn recalls at one point interposing rather quickly and saying, "Mr. Prime Minister, can I use the old phrase about not shooting the messenger?" Pham then calmed down a bit, and he laughed. In his report at the time, Seaborn stressed that Pham Van Dong had stated unequivocally that he wanted to keep open the channel of communication. Looking back to this second mission after the Gulf of Tonkin affair, that rather bizarre incident, and I'm not sure if we still sorted out exactly how that all happened. Seaborn says the North Vietnamese saw no reason to be flexible. They were quite confident if they hung tough and hung in there long enough, they would eventually have things the way they wanted them, and history proved them right. Seaborn feels that the Americans had genuine hopes for his mission and says they were almost desperately looking for a resolution to Vietnam. In his official 13th of August report, Seaborn warned that Hanoi was also genuinely convinced that there was no need to compromise. A subsequent secret State Department memorandum on the August mission viewed it as a second lost opportunity, stating, "The negotiating content of this mission was totally barren as a result of its timing and its complete focus on the events immediately preceding it rather than on the broader issues, as had been adumbrated at the June meeting." Significantly, this memorandum notes that the first organized NVA, North Vietnamese Army, units infiltrated into SVN, South Vietnam, were dispatched from the DRV in August 1964. From August, in fact, events in South Vietnam had the look of a speeded-up old newsreel. Washington delegations were rushing back and forth. Once again, the ambassador and the field commander were finding it hard to agree. The ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, was being dubbed as really very nervous. The Buddhists were rioting again. Coups and rumors of coups were met with almost daily indifference. Political reforms were proclaimed, then jettisoned along with the generals in a dizzy gyration of governments. On the 16th of August, General Nguyen Khan became president, ousting General Duong Van Minh and promising a new constitution. 11 days later, the constitution was withdrawn. Minh was back as chief of state, and Khan reverted to being premier. 2 days later, Khan was out altogether, pleading mental breakdown. 5 days later, he was in again as premier. 10 days later, he was out in the bloodless coup, and the next day he was back in a counter-coup, and so it went on, with Ambassador Taylor trying to keep a grip on his own nerves and on the government, if any of the day. Says Taylor, "In the course of my ambassadorship, which had been agreed to last just 1 year, I dealt with 5 governments, which meant 5 sets of senior generals, 5 sets of provincial chiefs governing 44 provinces. In other words, the house was cleaned, turned over 5 different times with the chaos that one can imagine, and furthermore, from the outset, there was no one firm government at any time to build on. On the 18th of August, when Seaborn's Hanoi report was relayed from Ottawa to Washington to Saigon, Ambassador Taylor advised the White House that bombing of the North might not be enough. General Westmoreland foresaw a need for U.S. Marines in South Vietnam. Johnson was under different pressure from United Nations Secretary General U Thant, who proposed that direct negotiations between the U.S. and North Vietnam be held in Rangoon. U Thant, who said he had Hanoi's agreement, was told negotiations could only be considered after the presidential election. On the 27th of August, as thousands of student demonstrators tried to attack ARVN headquarters in Saigon, Johnson was holding a combined birthday political party at his Texas ranch and pleading moderation. He said, "I've had advice to load our planes and bomb certain areas that I think would enlarge and escalate the war and result in our committing a good many American boys to fight a war I think ought to be fought by the boys of Asia." 3 days later, the Saigon government disclosed that in 1 week, 449 people had been killed on the streets in Buddhist-Catholic clashes, or by troops keeping order. At an urgent White House strategy session, it was decided that intensified air attacks against North Vietnam were probably necessary to retrieve the situation in the South. But Johnson could not set a date, and he would tell political advisers like J. Kenneth Galbraith that he was doing the minimum necessary and trying to restrain the military. In every sense, Galbraith was a large figure on Johnson's side. The 6-foot, 9-inch former ambassador to India, a distinguished diplomat, economist, and historian, was the administration's giant intellect, with the heaviest credentials, says Galbraith. "We were the same age, came to Washington at the same time. Good friends, and Johnson's liberal instincts were as deep as my own. He had campaigned hard that summer for Johnson, believing him a safer figure than Senator Goldwater. Johnson made a persuasive case," says Galbraith. "I remember his saying once, 'Ken, do you have any idea what Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay would be doing if I weren't here to restrain him?' One always came out of the meetings with the feeling that President Johnson was trying to follow a moderate policy or mediatory policy, or would have done so if the weight of the military and those dynamics of military involvement weren't pressing him in the other direction." Galbraith, who says that he remains an admirer of Johnson, the man would be the next key political defector from the administration as the war escalated. As chairman of a liberal group called Americans for Democratic Action, he turned his public oratory against the war. He was joined by Senator Fulbright and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Even before the election, the first notable protest against the war had occurred on the 30th of September at the University of California at Berkeley. But the polls were overwhelmingly supporting the president. The public was not his worry, nor especially the critical American press in Saigon. It was the first hints of dissent, the first signs of desertion among his old circle. Effectively, his White House guard that drove Johnson into deeper isolation and deeper action. Biographer Doris Kearns says that Johnson's sensitivity to criticism more and more walled him off from any kind of outside advice. As Johnson expressed it to Kearns, everybody was operating for motives If you were a journalist, you were against the war because you realized that to write good things about the war would never win you the Pulitzer Prize. If you were Fulbright, well, you had to develop a constituency that would make you different from the State Department. Johnson thought Fulbright aspired to be Secretary of State. If you were Bobby Kennedy, well, you want to be president. You want to take over Johnson's job, and you can't defer with him on the Great Society because he has done a wonderful job on that. Galbraith. Well, he had to symbolize the Harvard crowd. Says Galbraith, there were those of us who were concerned from the very beginning who wanted to talk to the people about our fears as to what was happening. But if a few were concerned, there were few yet prepared to listen. The people's fear was of Goldwater. American deaths in Vietnam were already becoming dramatic and alarming. On the 1st of November, 4 Americans were killed and 5 B-57 bombers destroyed as guerrillas mortared the U.S. Bien Hoa Air Base close to Saigon. 2 days later, Johnson won a landslide victory as the moderate candidate. As Americans voted, Johnson met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff to consider the U.S. response to Bien Hoa attack. The chiefs told the president there had been a communist change in the ground rules, meaning that because American troops were in Vietnam, this was no reason to attack them. The chiefs urged immediate strikes against air bases near Hanoi. Johnson instead ordered an updated bombing scenario and appointed Assistant Secretary of State William Bundy to liaise with the Pentagon. On the 5th of November, Bundy memoed the planning group. Bien Hoa may be repeated at any time, Bundy wrote. This would tend to force our hand, but would also give us a good springboard for any decision for stronger action. The president is clearly thinking in terms of maximum use of a Gulf of Tonkin rationale. In this planning, awaiting rationale, Daniel Ellsberg was summoned to assistance. On election day, I met in the office of William Bundy to look at alternative bombing options to begin soon. We didn't wait until the day after the election. That would have wasted time. We didn't meet the day before the election on this because that might have leaked. And Goldwater, who was proposing this, was in the process of being repudiated by the American people. In the last week of November, William Bundy presented the refined scenario to the president. It was for surgical bombing, an American version of the Asian Thousand Cuts. Target A would be taken out. If that brought no response, then Target B, and so on, at a quickening rate of destruction. Hanoi, despite its warning that bombing would be a real miscalculation, would seek peace within 2 to 6 months, Johnson was told. At the same time, thousands of Vietnamese of divergent interest were rioting in Saigon, demanding reforms and elections. As the riots spread to other cities, Ambassador Taylor's prediction that the Khan regime would not last out the year proved correct to the month. A military purge on 19th of December again ousted Khan as premier, and a few weeks later he was out of the country. Taylor, distressed at being right because it meant more was going wrong, stormed into ARVN headquarters to find out who were the coup leaders or who was his new ally. There he confronted Air Vice Marshal Nguyen Cao Khai, the General Nguyen Van Thieu, and with the South Vietnamese General Staff present and listening, America's former Chief of Staff, now Ambassador to the sovereign state, briefly lapsed into a 4-star dressing down of his juniors. "I told you all clearly," Taylor told them with disdain. "We Americans are tired of coups. Apparently, I wasted my words. Now you have made a real mess." Marshal Kai and General Few, until recently Commodore and Colonel, who would alternatively rule South Vietnam for its remaining 10 years, politely informed Ambassador Taylor to tend to his diplomatic duties. Compounding the mess, the new Armed Forces Council thereupon dissolved the Civilian High National Council, or what passed for Parliament, though the Army Command still allowed a succession of premiers. In one sense, America got its way. There would be no more coups. But this also left the U.S. with no other way but to follow the dictates of the generals. Its last ally, General Kahn, firmly supported military rule, saying as he prepared to bow out that South Vietnam was not fighting to carry out the policy of any foreign country. As the new High Command set about putting down civilian demonstrations, Johnson faced the same predicament as Kennedy had. He would either get out of Vietnam, or he could ignore the fact that the democracy, vital to the free world, did not exist, and get on with this inherited bitch of a war for which Kennedy had pledged America to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship to assure the survival of liberty. But getting out now presented far greater difficulties. As 1965 began, the free world was joining in, or at least those hemispheric nations heavily dependent on the U.S. umbrella. South Korea had sent 2,000 military advisors. Thailand and the Philippines were readying representative battalions, and Australia was being coerced on a contingency basis. And now, with the new year, Johnson received from his field commander news which left him no way out short of negotiation. North Vietnam had not retreated under the threat of bombing. It had not advanced, Johnson was informed. Westmoreland's MACV command reported that North Vietnamese troops had entered the war directly. 4 NVA divisions had been sighted. Their impact was swift and devastating, says Westmoreland. The Vietnamese ARVN were losing a battalion a week destroyed by North Vietnamese troops or by Viet Cong main force troops operating from border base camps. That trend, if continued, would have resulted in a disastrous outcome. Westmoreland's MACV records reveal that on the 1st of January 1965, the U.S. itself took a major preparatory step towards entering the ground war. Contingency plans for the dispatch of American combat troops were put on first phase alert, coded OPLAN, OPLAN 3264. That date was also the contingency deadline advocated by Ambassador Taylor for bombing the North. But Westmoreland's argument was for troops, and Taylor, while still arguing for gradual bombing, had strongly opposed as overkill the Joint Chiefs Election Day recommendation to bomb Hanoi-adjacent air bases. Johnson kept the National Security Council in almost constant session as he considered the conflicting advice and which course he should proceed on: air or land war, or both. It was no longer a case of contingencies, but of choice. In effect, Washington was adopting Hanoi's analysis, the very weakness of America's allied forces, a widening war. By the end of January, the consensus was that air war against the North promised the most results and the least controversy, and a week later it was set in continuous motion by America's bloodiest day so far in Vietnam. On the 7th of February, hours after a guerrilla blitz on the U.S. military compound at Pleiku in which 9 Americans were killed and 76 wounded, Johnson authorized Flaming Dart. It was a Pentagon phase, one code name for an eye for an eye response. From the 7th Fleet, 49 Skyhawks and Crusaders swept unopposed on the Dong Hoi Barracks, North Vietnam's major troop dispersal base above the partition line. Simultaneously, across South Vietnam, a prearranged plan for evacuating U.S. dependents went into immediate effect. On the same day as hundreds of wives and children were airlifted out, Johnson ordered the countdown for the Phase 2 sustained bombing. It was codenamed Rolling Thunder. At dawn on the 2nd of March, 100 fighter bombers crossed the 17th parallel, and within minutes, bridges, rail lines, port and supply facilities were devastated in a bombing plan a year in the making. On national television, Johnson told his people, "I regret the necessities of war have compelled us to bomb North Vietnam. We have carefully limited those raids. They have been directed at concrete and steel and not at human life." With Rolling Thunder, the groundswell of world criticism and concern began. Senator William Fulbright was dismayed. Johnson had always maintained that his purpose was not to widen the war, but to make peace. But, says Fulbright, he changed his views in early 1965 with the Pleiku incident, and he began to widen the war. As Secretary of State Rusk saw it, there was no change of mind. There was a major change in the situation in Vietnam. Rusk says that after our election, the entry of North Vietnamese regiments was threatening to cut the place in two, and the shape of the struggle became very different. We had to consider whether we got out under those circumstances or try to resist that increased force being applied by the North Vietnamese, and the decision was made to try to resist it. Immediate world reaction was fear of escalation to superpower confrontation. The UN Secretary-General, U Thant, again called for a peace conference, this time to include all the nuclear nations, the US, USSR, China, Britain, and France, plus the 2 Vietnams. The U.S. responded that North Vietnam must first cease aggression. Rusk contends that it was China, not the U.S., which opposed negotiations throughout, saying it was not a matter for the United Nations. There were times, says Rusk, when we wanted to go to the United Nations over Vietnam. When the Chinese rejected the UN, we said, all right, let's use the Geneva machinery. But the Chinese prevented the use of that. It was the harsh, adamant, unyielding attitude of the Chinese that had a great deal to do with making it so difficult to bring the North Vietnamese into any kind of discussion. Hanoi's version, disclosed in a special interview for This History, is a totally opposite one. It contends that the U.S. and China came to the hands-off agreement to allow the U.S. freedom to pursue the war. In these different versions, historians may find some insight and contemporary meaning on the crucial issue of why the great powers failed to resolve the war that first threatened world peace and then maintained world tension for an entire decade. The U.S., judging from secret memoranda, did attempt new negotiations with Hanoi, believing that China might support these. This attempt was based on French contacts with the Chinese during the critical January period, when both sides made moves for a ground war. The French were optimistic that Peking would relay to Hanoi, and thus implicitly endorse proposals for a neutral South Vietnam with wider powers according to the ICC, the International Control Commission. In early March, after the escalation to Rolling Thunder, ICC intermediary Blair Seaborn was sent back to Hanoi specifically to probe whether China was exerting any leverage. This time, Seaborn failed to see Prime Minister Pham Van Dong. Instead, he met with ICC liaison chief Colonel Havan Lao. Seaborn went over the text of the French conversation with the Chinese. Havan Lao responded that it contained nothing new and that Hanoi already had the text from the Chinese. Seaborn was left feeling that there was no interest. In fact, Havan Lao says that the United States had left it too late. He says that at any time in its first year of office, the Johnson administration could have put an end to the war if it had accepted the line traced by the National Liberation Front of the South for the withdrawal of U.S. forces and government of coalition with a foreign policy of peace and neutrality. Instead, Johnson sought to annihilate the NLF. Havan Lao, who would become Vietnam's ambassador to the United Nations, says that with the aero-naval war against North Vietnam, the occasion was lost to end the war. From that point on, Havan Lao agrees that China exploited the war and in effect says China trapped the U.S. into a prolonged war. Havan Lao says Peking made it known to Washington that China would not make war with the U.S. if the U.S. didn't attack China. And with that, with the Chinese card in hand, Johnson pursued the war. Johnson, Havan Lao concludes, was ill-advised, and he himself was responsible for that. He was responsible for his foreign policy. Indeed, Johnson was now acutely feeling this responsibility, having commenced Rolling Thunder, or graduated bombing of the North on the 2nd of March. He was under immediate pressure to adopt a similar policy in the ground war and commit large American combat forces at a publicly digestible rate. Wow. The first wave of Marines was now en route to Vietnam. The sighting of North Vietnamese units had followed the Phase 1 bombing. This had triggered Phase 2, or Rolling Thunder, which then became an argument for sending in the Marines for base secretary. This had triggered Phase 2, or Rolling Thunder, which then became an argument for sending in the Marines for base security in case of retaliation. In late February, during the bombing countdown, the troop contingency plan had also been made operational. Johnson authorized the dispatch of 2 battalions of Marines to guard the U.S. air and sea base at Da Nang. They were scheduled to go ashore on the 8th of March. The President had not informed the public of this in his March 2nd broadcast. Within the space of a week, the American people heard of this second fateful decision. Secretary of State Rusk announced that the Marines were not to engage in combat and would fire only if fired upon. But well before this announcement, Johnson, having agreed to send security forces, was being asked to go the whole hog and commit combat troops immediately, and thereafter as needed. Johnson now faced this paramount decision. He had to agonize alone, haggard, visibly aging, and with his casting vote. His most trusted advisers were sharply divided on whether air or land war was the most viable option, and each step Johnson took became an argument for the next. He was not at all outrunning the stampede. He was being herded along by the military dynamics. He had taken the war to the North because of the political mess in the South, or as a military cable phrased it, after General Khan's removal, Khan goes abroad, Rolling Thunder rolls. He had opted for air war to avoid a ground war. He had been told that North Vietnam would be on its knees in 2 months or so. Now he was told there was not that much time. Saigon's Young Turks were vocally challenging Johnson's mettle. The South was about to be overrun, while the U.S. stood by. The Pentagon was telling Johnson to deploy troops before the tragedy. Secretary of State Rusk thought the South might be cut in two, and in the North, Rolling Thunder showed every sign of fizzling. The bombing was scheduled at irregular intervals. This graduated concept envisaged that after a pause there would be a response. But from the start, this took the form of heavy anti-aircraft resistance. The Air Force had reported that North Vietnamese defenses were stronger than imagined, though it could not conceive just how strong they would prove. Though Rolling Thunder was essentially written off very early as an effective solution, the bombing continued for 8 years. U.S. planes struck at North Vietnam 350,000 times. In North and South Vietnam, the U.S. dropped close to 8 million tons of bombs, quadruple the tonnage used throughout World War II. The U.S. estimated its aircraft losses at about 1,000 over the North, 3,720 overall, plus 5,000 helicopters. More than 8,000 American airmen were killed. The CIA assessed that the bombing had hardened Hanoi's resolve, and now Secretary of Defense McNamara, who had promoted the bombing strategy, was backing Field Commander William Westmoreland in saying it was not enough. America must enter a ground war. Westmoreland argued from the concept stage that phased bombing just wouldn't work. As he explains, once the North Vietnamese realized what was taking place, they dissipated the targets, and instead, for instance, of having their petroleum concentrated in one place, they moved it in little packages around the country. I always considered the enemy a pretty tough group, that they would adapt themselves to a particular level of bombing, and that the message Washington was trying to submit would not get through by this off and on again bombing. Westmoreland argued that the bombing would logically bring retaliation against U.S. air bases in the South, and that after the Bien Hoa and Pleiku guerrilla attacks, the U.S. could no longer rely on South Vietnamese forces to defend these bases. He considered the main U.S. base at Da Nang on the coast only 100 miles south of the partition line especially vulnerable. In supporting Westmoreland, the Joint Chiefs initially recommended Marine units for Da Nang as a one-shot response to a particular security problem. As the Pentagon phrased it, troops were needed to deter overt retaliation to the airstrikes. In other words, troops were now necessary to back up an air offensive designed to avoid the use of troops. Wow. Ambassador Taylor expressed his alarm. He cabled Johnson warning that if the Marines took an ARVN security duties, it would encourage Saigon to shuck off greater responsibilities. He urged reliance on the air war until more ARVN units were trained. Taylor criticized the unnecessarily timid conduct of the bombing, proposing a more dynamic schedule of strikes. Though the bombing schedule had been devised by the Pentagon, Taylor considered that Western peace efforts were holding up the air war. He cabled that current feverish diplomatic activity, particularly by French and British, was confusing the chance to progressively turn the screws on the DRV. Failure to do this was encouraging requests for combat troops. If these were sent, Taylor told Johnson, what would happen? The white-faced soldier cannot be assimilated by the population. He cannot distinguish between friendly and unfriendly Vietnamese. The Marines are not trained or equipped for jungle guerrilla warfare. As quoted in the Pentagon Papers, Taylor prophesied that the U.S., like France, would fail to adapt to such conditions. But the Joint Chiefs, until recently headed by Taylor, adamantly disagreed. The Marine deployment, far from being an encouragement to use U.S. troops in combat, would free 4 South Vietnamese battalions for anti-guerrilla operations, it was argued. And if it came to it, the Marines had a distinguished record in counterinsurgency operations. Johnson, having sent the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Saigon as his most trusted military man, had removed the main restraint from Washington, where it counted most. Taylor had been Army Chief of Staff for 4 years, then personal advisor to Kennedy and Johnson, before becoming chairman of the JCS in 1962. With these credentials, Taylor's judgment of the military climate in the U.S. during the period is an authoritative and disturbing one. Starting in 1961, he says, and then progressively, the right wing were urging the use of our ground forces. I personally, says Taylor, realized the undesirability of this. The longer I was in Vietnam, the more I felt the danger of our taking too much of the war from the Vietnamese. Once we brought any troops in, that was the nose of the camel. It would be difficult to know how much was enough. Johnson had appointed a senior military man to be ambassador to Saigon in order to end the previous friction between the embassy and the military command. And Taylor says, my authority as ambassador put me in charge of the military operation. But now Johnson's own generals in Saigon were disagreeing. Taylor had been sent to advise what the policy should be, and General Westmoreland had been sent to execute it. But Johnson was now about to reverse these roles. Westmoreland says he was told by Defense Secretary McNamara to ask for whatever he wanted, and he wanted troops. He was supported at the State Department, where the Assistant Secretary for Southeast Asia, William Bundy, assessed that the South Vietnamese army might collapse. It seemed at that stage, says Bundy, that only an infusion of American combat units, division, and all the rest could stop the rot and level things off and make progress. The new political power in Saigon, General Thieu, also supported Westmoreland. The communists, says Thieu, controlled 75% of the countryside. We controlled only the chief towns. We had the impression we would be overrun. There was a crucial need for American troops. Finally, Ambassador Taylor concurred with the landing of Marines. Taylor describes Westmoreland as a close friend and says, Westy and I checked constantly on our thinking. The two generals were veterans of Korea. Both had been superintendents of West Point, says Taylor. When Westy brought in evidence of the decay of the South Vietnamese forces in the Da Nang area and the increasing threat of infiltration from the north, I eventually decided yes, Da Nang is in danger. Taylor recommended sending 1 battalion. Westmoreland recommended 2. The Joint Chiefs recommended 2. Johnson authorized 2. Having approved the first troops without yet announcing it, Johnson, in Taylor's metaphor, had been sold the whole camel, says Taylor. Very soon I saw cables going around the world that indicated that our armed forces in every place were being alerted to the possibility of getting involved in Vietnam. And that resulted in a string of complaints, as you will find in the record, against the over-rapid introduction without careful concurrence with my embassy, assuring for the readiness to receive troops. Also politically, from the point of view of the Saigon government. The first troops, says Westmoreland, were invited in to protect our air bases. Now, once those troops were at those bases, it made no sense at all to have them dig in and go strictly on the defensive. In the days immediately before and after the dispatch of first 2 battalions, President Johnson had Pentagon request for 44 additional battalions. While considering these, Johnson ordered that units sent to Vietnam could be used in combat, but he ordered that this decision be kept secret. From this point, says biographer Doris Kearns, Johnson did not look back until his presidency was destroyed. As he became more committed to action, says Kearns, he became less and less doubtful. Johnson was no longer alone. Though some questioned the wisdom, none seriously doubted that America would prevail. Initially hesitant, Ambassador Taylor modified his position on combat troops. I became for it, he says, because we obviously had the resources to end the thing if we followed that course vigorously. With the imminent landing of Marines, Johnson ordered all his top men to Washington for what next? Conference, and Taylor attended. What was our intention now? Where do we go from here? And I found that the president and I heard no advisor who did not share his feelings, but that we really had to lift the level of our support to include ground forces until the field commander reported that we had a stable situation. On the 8th of March, 1965, a flotilla of landing craft thudded on to the beaches at Da Nang, where the French had reinvaded 20 years before. And the first American combat troops waded ashore. They numbered only 3,500 then.